Hey there. Tonight, we'll step into a world most people have forgotten. A time when ice wasn't just something you made in a tray, but something dangerous men carved from frozen lakes, risking their lives with every swing of a saw. Long before refrigerators and freezers existed, blocks of natural ice were worth their weight in silver. From the frozen ponds of New England to the humid harbors of the Caribbean, an entire industry was built around harvesting winter itself. But this wasn't clean or easy work. These were bitterly cold mornings, iron tools sharper than razors, and a surface that could break beneath your feet without warning. The men who did this weren't looking for fame, only a day's pay and a way to keep warm in the process. Some brought their sons with them. Some never came home at all. Tonight, we'll walk onto the cracking ice with them. We'll feel the wind burn our cheeks, hear the grind of saws in the silence of winter, and understand what it meant to fight the cold, not just for survival, but so someone somewhere could sip a cold drink in summer. Let's begin. Before freezers, ice was gold. In the early 19th century, long before the hum of refrigeration units became part of everyday life, natural ice was a rare and precious commodity. It was harvested from frozen lakes and rivers in the dead of winter, packed in sawdust for insulation, and shipped across continents and oceans to chill drinks, preserve food, and even save lives. The idea of having ice in the tropics, in places where the sun scorched the earth year-round, was so fantastical that many dismissed it as madness. But for a handful of daring entrepreneurs and thousands of rugged laborers, ice was not just a luxury. It was a livelihood, a symbol of ingenuity, and a source of immense risk. The story begins in New England, where winters were harsh and lakes froze thick. Here, men ventured onto the ice with axes, saws, and horse-drawn plows, carving massive blocks from the frozen surface. These blocks, often weighing hundreds of pounds, were cut with precision and hauled to shore, where they were stacked in towering ice houses. The work was brutal. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and the ice was unpredictable. A single misstep could send a man or an entire team of horses plunging into frigid water. Frostbite was common, and hypothermia lurked in every gust of wind. Yet despite the dangers, the ice harvest was a seasonal ritual, a lifeline for communities that depended on the trade. Frederick Tudor, a Boston merchant with a vision bordering on obsession, was the driving force behind the global ice trade. In 1806, he attempted to ship ice to the Caribbean, believing that even in the sweltering heat of Havana, people would pay handsomely for the luxury of a chilled drink. His first shipment was a disaster. Most of the ice melted before it reached its destination. But Tudor was undeterred. He experimented with insulation, using sawdust from local mills to keep the ice cold. He built better ice houses, refined his shipping methods, and slowly the idea took hold. By the 1830s, Tudor was exporting ice to India, Brazil, and beyond. His success turned ice into a global commodity, and his methods became the blueprint for an industry that would span decades. The logistics of the ice trade were staggering. Ice harvested in Maine could end up in Calcutta. Having survived a months-long journey across the Atlantic and around the Cape of Good Hope, ships were specially outfitted to carry the frozen cargo, and ports around the world built infrastructure to store and distribute it. In tropical cities, ice was a revelation. It allowed for cold drinks, preserved meat and dairy, and even enabled medical treatments that required cooling. Hospitals used ice to reduce fevers and treat injuries, and wealthy households flaunted their access to it as a mark of status. In places like New Orleans, Havana, and Bombay, ice became synonymous with modernity and progress. But behind the glamour of chilled cocktails and preserved delicacies was a workforce that risked everything to make it possible. Ice workers labored in silence, often before dawn, their breath freezing in the air as they hacked away at the lake's surface. They wore wool coats and leather boots, but the cold seeped through everything. The ice was slippery, The tools were heavy, and the margin for error was razor thin. A cracked surface could collapse without warning, and rescue was nearly impossible. Some workers drowned, their bodies recovered days later. Others suffered lifelong injuries from falls, frostbite, or overexertion. There were no unions, no safety regulations, just the promise of a paycheck and the pride of hard work. Entire towns revolved around the ice harvest. In places like Kennebec, Maine, the winter months were a frenzy of activity. Families relied on the income, and local businesses thrived on the trade. Children grew up watching the harvest, dreaming of the day they'd be strong enough to join the crews. The ice houses loomed like cathedrals, filled with shimmering blocks that would soon travel the world. And when spring came, the industry shifted gears. Ships were loaded, contracts fulfilled, and the cycle began anew. The cultural impact of ice was profound. It changed the way people ate, drank, and lived. In the American South, ice enabled the rise of iced tea and chilled mint juleps. In India, it allowed colonial officials to mimic the comforts of home. In Europe, it fueled scientific research and culinary innovation. Ice became a symbol of civilization, a marker of technological progress. And yet, it remained deeply tied to nature, dependent on the whims of winter, the thickness of the freeze, and the endurance of those who harvested it. As the 19th century progressed, mechanical refrigeration began to emerge. Inventors experimented with chemical coolants and steam-powered compressors, seeking to replicate what nature had provided. By the early 20th century, artificial ice and electric refrigerators began to replace the old ways. The ice houses fell silent, the saws rusted, and the trade faded into history. But for a brief, glittering moment, ice was gold, carved from winter's grip, shipped across the globe, and cherished like treasure. The legacy of the ice trade lives on in the quiet corners of history, in the stories of men who risked freezing to death to harvest winter itself. Their work reshaped global commerce, transformed daily life, and laid the foundation for the modern world's obsession with cold. Today, when we reach for an ice cube, we rarely think of the frozen lakes, the perilous labor, or the ships that once carried blocks of ice across oceans. But in the 1800s, every cube was a triumph, a testament to human ingenuity, endurance, and the relentless pursuit of comfort in a world that was anything but. In the early 1800s, a peculiar kind of gold rush swept through the frozen landscapes of New England. But instead of precious metals, the treasure was ice, solid, glistening blocks of frozen water that promised wealth, innovation, and a new kind of global trade. Entrepreneurs, visionaries, and risk-takers began to see profit in something that had always been free and fleeting. Winter ponds, once quiet and overlooked, suddenly became gold mines. The ice rush had begun. At first glance, the idea of selling ice seemed absurd. Ice melted. It was seasonal. It was heavy and difficult to transport. But for those with imagination and grit, these obstacles were merely challenges to overcome. The demand was there. In the sweltering cities of the American South, in the tropical colonies of the British Empire, in bustling ports where luxury and novelty were prized. What was missing was a system, a way to harvest, store, and ship ice efficiently and profitably. And that's exactly what the pioneers of the ice trade set out to build. New England, with its long frigid winters and abundance of freshwater lakes, was perfectly positioned to become the epicenter of this icy revolution. Towns like Wenham, Kennebec, and Charlestown transformed almost overnight. As soon as the lakes froze thick enough, usually in January or February, crews would descend with tools and horses, carving the ice into neat, geometric blocks. These blocks were hauled to shore, stacked in massive ice houses, and insulated with sawdust to prevent melting. The process was labor-intensive, dangerous, and required precise timing, but the rewards were immense. Frederick Tudor, already known as the Ice King, was joined by a growing cast of competitors and collaborators. Some were seasoned merchants. Others were farmers looking to make extra income during the winter months. They built networks of ice houses, negotiated shipping contracts, and experimented with new techniques to improve insulation and reduce waste. The industry grew rapidly. By the 1840s, thousands of tons of ice were being shipped annually from New England to cities like New York, Charleston, New Orleans, and even Havana. The ice trade was no longer a novelty. It was a booming business. The economic impact on New England was profound. Entire communities were built around the ice harvest. Local mills supplied sawdust for insulation. Blacksmiths forged specialized tools. Shipbuilders designed vessels optimized for carrying frozen cargo. Railroads extended their lines to reach ice houses, and ports expanded to accommodate the growing traffic. Ice became a pillar of the regional economy, providing seasonal employment and stimulating innovation across multiple sectors. But the ice rush wasn't just about money. It was also about prestige, influence, and the thrill of conquering nature. To ship ice to the tropics, to deliver winter to places where it never existed, was a feat of imagination and engineering. It required not just physical labor, but logistical genius. Ice had to be harvested quickly, stored carefully, and shipped promptly. Delays could mean disaster. A poorly insulated shipment might arrive as a puddle. A miscalculation in timing could ruin an entire season's work. The stakes were high and the competition fierce. As the trade expanded, so did the scale of operations. Ice houses grew larger, some capable of storing tens of thousands of tons. Harvesting techniques evolved. Instead of hand saws, workers used horse-drawn cutters and eventually steam-powered equipment. The blocks became more uniform, the stacking more efficient. Every step of the process was refined to maximize yield and minimize loss. And with each improvement, the reach of the ice trade extended further. In cities that received ice shipments, the impact was transformative. Restaurants could serve chilled dishes. Hospitals could treat fevers and injuries more effectively. Butchers and fishmongers could preserve their goods longer. Ice became a symbol of modernity, a mark of progress. In the American South, it enabled the rise of ice drinks, mint juleps, lemonade, and sweet tea. In colonial outposts like Calcutta, it allowed British officials to recreate the comforts of home. Ice was no longer just a substance, it was a lifestyle. Yet for all its glamour, the ice rush remained rooted in hard labor. The men who harvested ice worked in brutal conditions, often for meager pay. They faced frostbite, exhaustion, and the constant threat of injury. The ice was slippery and unpredictable. Horses could fall through, tools could malfunction, and the cold was relentless. There were no modern safety standards, no protective gear, just wool, leather, and determination. These workers were the backbone of the industry, and their efforts made the entire enterprise possible. As demand grew, so did the need for innovation. Entrepreneurs experimented with new insulation materials, better shipping containers, and more efficient harvesting methods. Some tried to create artificial ice, using chemicals and mechanical devices. These early attempts were crude and expensive, but they hinted at a future where ice might be manufactured rather than harvested. Still, for much of the 19th century, natural ice reigned supreme. The ice rush also had environmental consequences. Lakes were dredged and altered to improve ice yield. Forests were cleared to build ice houses and supply sawdust. The industry consumed vast amounts of wood, labor, and energy. And while it brought prosperity to many, it also created disparities. Wealthy merchants profited handsomely, while laborers endured harsh conditions with little recognition. The ice trade was a microcosm of industrial America, a blend of innovation, exploitation, and ambition. By the late 1800s, the industry reached its peak. Ice was shipped to every corner of the globe. New England's frozen ponds were mapped, measured, and harvested with military precision. The trade was so vital that newspapers reported on ice yields and shipping schedules. A warm winter could spell economic disaster. A successful harvest could mean booming business. Ice was no longer just a seasonal product. It was a year-round enterprise. But change was on the horizon. Mechanical refrigeration was improving. Inventors like Carl von Linde and John Gorey were developing machines that could produce ice artificially. These devices were expensive and limited at first, but they represented a fundamental shift. The idea of controlling cold, of creating ice without winter, was revolutionary. Slowly, the balance began to tip. Still, in the early decades of the ice rush, natural ice was king. It shaped economies, transformed cities, and connected distant parts of the world. It was harvested with sweat and blood, shipped with care, and consumed with delight. The frozen ponds of New England became the source of a global phenomenon, and the men who worked them became unlikely heroes of industrial progress. Today, the legacy of the ice rush is largely forgotten. The ice houses have crumbled, the tools rusted, and the trade replaced by humming refrigerators and sleek freezers. But in the 1800s, ice was more than just frozen water. It was ambition made tangible, a fleeting substance turned into enduring wealth. It was the promise of comfort in a world that was often harsh. And for those who dared to chase it, ice was gold. Waking before dawn in a world of ice was not a poetic metaphor for the men who harvested frozen water in the 1800s. It was their daily reality. Long before the sun crept over the horizon, ice workers were already trudging through snow-covered fields, their breath crystallizing in the air, their boots crunching against the frost. The silence of early morning was broken only by the distant clatter of tools and the low murmur of voices preparing for another day of grueling labor. These men didn't just work in the cold. They lived in it, breathed it, and risked their lives in it. The ice harvest began in the dead of winter, when lakes and rivers had frozen thick enough to support the weight of men, horses, and heavy equipment. Timing was everything. Too early, and the ice was thin and dangerous. Too late, and the thaw would begin. When the moment was right, crews mobilized quickly. They worked in shifts, often starting before sunrise, to take advantage of the coldest hours, when the ice was most stable and the risk of melting was lowest. Their gear was rudimentary. Wool coats, leather gloves, thick scarves, and felt-lined boots offered some protection, but the cold seeped through everything. There were no synthetic fabrics, no thermal insulation, no modern conveniences. Just layers of natural material and the sheer will to endure. The workers carried axes, saws, and iron bars, tools that were heavy and unwieldy, but essential for carving the ice. Horse-drawn plows scored the surface into grids, and teams of men followed behind, cutting the blocks with precision and speed. The work was physically punishing. Each block of ice weighed hundreds of pounds and had to be maneuvered carefully to avoid cracking or slipping. Workers developed techniques for lifting, sliding, and stacking the blocks, often using long poles and ropes to guide them. The ice was slick, and footing was treacherous. A single misstep could send a man sprawling, or worse, plunging into the freezing water below. Rescue was difficult and dangerous. If someone fell through, others had to act quickly, using poles and ropes to pull him out before hypothermia set in. Despite the risks, the ice harvest was a source of pride. It was a tradition passed down through generations, a rite of passage for young men in New England towns. Fathers taught sons how to read the ice, how to wield the tools, how to stay warm and alert. The camaraderie among workers was strong. They relied on each other, joked to keep spirits high, and shared meals around fires built on the shore. Coffee, bread, and salted meat were staples, consumed quickly before returning to the frozen expanse. The ice itself was a marvel. Clear, blue, and dense, It was prized for its purity and strength. Workers took care to avoid areas with air bubbles or cracks, which could weaken the blocks. They developed an intimate knowledge of each lake, its depth, its freeze patterns, its quirks. Some lakes were known for producing exceptionally clear ice, and these became coveted sources for high-end shipments. The best ice was reserved for export to tropical destinations, where it would be used in hospitals, hotels, and the homes of the wealthy. As the sun rose, the frozen landscape transformed. Light glinted off the ice, casting long shadows and illuminating the breath of the workers. The pace quickened. Horses pulled sleds loaded with blocks to the ice houses, where teams stacked them in towering formations. Sawdust was shoveled between the layers to insulate and prevent melting. The ice houses were massive, often built with thick wooden walls and designed to hold thousands of tons. Inside, the temperature remained cold year-round, preserving the harvest until it could be shipped. The noise of the harvest grew louder as the day progressed. The rhythmic chopping of saws, the creak of sleds, the shouts of foremen directing crews. It was a symphony of labor. And yet, there was a strange beauty to it. The contrast between the harsh conditions and the quiet determination of the workers created a kind of poetry. These men were sculpting winter itself, carving out pieces of a season and sending them across the globe. By midday, fatigue set in. Muscles ached, fingers stiffened, and the cold became harder to ignore. Breaks were brief, and the work relentless. But there was a sense of purpose. Each block harvested was a step toward profit, survival, and pride. The ice trade was not just a job. It was a lifeline for entire communities. Local economies depended on it. Families relied on the income. And the reputation of a town could be built on the quality of its ice. As the sun dipped low in the sky, the crews began to wind down. The temperature dropped again, and the ice grew harder. Tools were packed away, sleds returned to the shore, and fires rekindled for warmth. Workers gathered to share stories, compare bruises, and plan for the next day. Some returned home to warm meals and soft beds. Others stayed in bunkhouses near the lakes, sleeping in shifts and rising again before dawn. The cycle repeated day after day, week after week, until the thaw began. Then the ice houses were sealed, the tools stored, and the shipments prepared. Trains and ships carried the frozen cargo to distant lands, where it would be met with awe and appreciation. And back in New England, the lakes returned to their quiet state, waiting for the next winter, the next harvest, the next generation of men willing to wake before dawn in a world of ice. The tools of the ice trade were not delicate instruments. They were heavy, sharp, and dangerous, forged from iron and steel, designed to bite into frozen lakes and carve out blocks of winter itself. For the men who wielded them, these tools were both lifelines and hazards. They enabled the harvest of ice on a massive scale, but they also demanded respect. A moment's carelessness could mean injury or worse. In the world of 19th century ice harvesting, mastery of the tools was as essential as endurance in the cold. The process began with the ice plow, a hulking device often drawn by horses across the frozen surface. Its iron teeth scored the ice into a grid, marking the outlines of future blocks. The plow had to be guided with precision. Too shallow, and the cuts were ineffective. Too deep, and the ice could crack prematurely. Workers walked alongside the horses, steering the plow and watching for signs of weakness in the ice. The sound of iron scraping against frozen water echoed across the lake, a rhythmic prelude to the harder labor ahead. Once the grid was established, the real cutting began. Men used long-handled saws, often 6 feet in length, with jagged teeth designed to chew through thick ice. These saws were heavy and unwieldy, requiring strength and coordination. 2 men might work in tandem, one pulling while the other pushed, their movements synchronized like dancers in a brutal ballet. The saws kicked up shards of ice and water, soaking gloves and sleeves, numbing fingers despite layers of wool. Each block had to be cut cleanly to avoid waste. A jagged edge could complicate stacking or cause the block to fracture during transport. After the blocks were freed, massive iron tongs came into play. These were not the kitchen variety. They were industrial tools, often as long as a man's arm, with serrated jaws that clamped onto the ice. Workers used them to drag blocks across the lake, maneuver them onto sleds, and lift them into ice houses. But tongs required skill. A poor grip could cause a block to slip and shatter. A misjudged lift could strain a back or crush a foot. The ice was unforgiving, and the tools amplified its dangers. In addition to plows, saws, and tongs, workers relied on chisels, bars, and hooks. Chisels were used to refine cuts or break stubborn sections. Iron bars helped pry blocks loose from the lake's surface. Hooks were essential for guiding ice into position, especially when stacking in ice houses. Each tool had its own rhythm, its own technique. Veterans of the trade could wield them with fluidity, turning raw muscle into practiced motion. Novices, on the other hand, often learned the hard way, through blisters, bruises, and bitter cold. The tools were not just dangerous because of their sharp edges or heavy weight. They were dangerous because of the environment in which they were used. Ice was slippery, unpredictable, and constantly shifting. A worker might be balancing on a narrow strip of frozen water, surrounded by open channels and jagged blocks. One wrong move, one slip of a saw or misstep with a tong, and he could fall. Injuries were common: deep cuts, broken bones, crushed fingers. There were no modern safety standards, no protective gear beyond what a man could afford, just wool, leather, and caution. Despite the risks, the tools were revered. They were passed down to generations, maintained with care, and adapted to local conditions. Some towns had their own designs, their own innovations. Blacksmiths played a crucial role, forging and repairing tools, experimenting with new shapes and materials. A well-made saw could last for years. A reliable set of tongs was worth its weight in gold. Workers often personalized their tools, carving initials into handles or wrapping grips with cloth for comfort. These were not disposable items. They were extensions of the men who used them. The ice houses themselves were built with the tools in mind. Ramps, pulleys, and rails helped move blocks into place. Workers used hooks and bars to guide ice into towering stacks, layering sawdust between each block to insulate and prevent melting. The process was methodical, almost architectural. Each block had to fit precisely. A misaligned stack could collapse, damaging the ice and endangering workers. The tools were essential not just for harvesting, but for storing and preserving the product. As the industry grew, so did the sophistication of the tools. Steam-powered cutters began to appear, reducing the need for manual sawing. Conveyor belts and mechanical lifts eased the burden of stacking. But in many towns, the traditional tools remained dominant. They were reliable, familiar, and effective. And for the men who had spent years mastering them, they were irreplaceable. The danger of the tools was matched only by the pride they inspired. To wield a saw with precision, to guide a block with tongs through a narrow channel, to stack ice in perfect formation, these were marks of skill and experience. Workers competed informally, showing off their technique, challenging each other to faster cuts or cleaner stacks. Injuries were worn like badges. Stories of close calls and daring rescues circulated around fires and bunkhouses. The tools were not just instruments, they were symbols of identity. Today, those tools are relics. They hang in museums, rusting in barns, or buried in forgotten sheds. But in the 1800s, they were the backbone of an industry that spanned continents. They carved winter into blocks, shaped commerce, and enabled a global trade in frozen water. They were heavy, sharp, and dangerous, and they were wielded by men who knew that every cut, every lift, Every stack was a step toward survival, success, and the strange, glittering promise of ice. The ice wasn't always safe to walk on. That simple truth haunted every step taken by the men who harvested frozen lakes in the 1800s. Beneath their boots lay a surface that could betray them at any moment, a deceptive sheet of frozen water that looked solid but could crack, shift, or collapse without warning. For ice workers, danger wasn't just part of the job. It was the job. Every morning they stepped onto the lake. They gambled with their lives. The unpredictability of ice was one of its most terrifying qualities. It could appear thick and stable, only to reveal hidden weaknesses, air pockets, thin spots, or fractures invisible to the eye. A sudden change in temperature could weaken the surface. A heavy load, like a horse-drawn plow or a sled stacked with blocks, could push the ice past its limit. And when it gave way, it did so with brutal speed. There was no time to react, no second chance. One moment a man was working, the next he was gone, swallowed by the freezing water below. The stories of men falling through the ice were common, whispered around bunkhouses, and passed down through generations. Some were lucky. They managed to grab onto the edge, were pulled out by ropes or poles, and survived, shivering, soaked, and shaken. Others weren't so fortunate. The cold water shocked the body instantly, constricting muscles and stealing breath. Heavy clothing became a trap, dragging men down. Rescue was nearly impossible if the fall happened far from shore or in deep water. Some never came back up. Even horses, essential to the ice harvest, were vulnerable. They pulled plows and sleds across the frozen surface, their hooves slipping, their breath steaming in the cold. But they were heavy, and the ice didn't always hold. When a horse broke through, panic set in. Workers rushed to save the animal, using ropes, boards, and sheer strength. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they didn't. The loss of a horse was devastating, emotionally, financially, and logistically. It was a reminder that the ice was in charge, not the men who worked it. To mitigate the risks, experienced workers developed techniques for reading the ice. They tapped it with poles, listened for hollow sounds, watched for changes in color or texture. They avoided areas near currents, where the ice was thinner, and steered clear of spots where snow had insulated the surface and slowed freezing. But even the most seasoned veterans could be fooled. Ice was a living thing, constantly shifting, responding to weather, weight, and time. It had moods, and it didn't care about experience. The fear of falling through was ever present. It shaped the way workers moved, the way they spoke, even the way they breathed. They walked with caution, tested each step, and kept tools close. Ropes were coiled and ready. Poles were sharpened and within reach. Fires burned on shore, not just for warmth, but as emergency stations. If someone fell in, they needed heat immediately, to thaw frozen limbs, to restart circulation, to survive. Despite the danger, the work continued. The ice harvest was too important to stop. Communities depended on it. Families relied on the income. And the men who did the work took pride in their resilience. They joked about the cold, told stories of close calls, and honored those who didn't make it. The lake was both workplace and graveyard, a place of opportunity and peril. It demanded respect, and it gave none in return. Some towns erected memorials to lost workers. Others held annual gatherings to remember those who had fallen through. The names were etched in local memory, fathers, brothers, sons who had vanished beneath the ice. Their stories became part of the culture, woven into the fabric of the trade. And for every man who stepped onto the lake, those stories were a reminder. The ice wasn't always safe to walk on. Today, the risks of ice harvesting are largely forgotten. The trade has faded, replaced by machines and refrigeration. But in the 1800s, the danger was real, immediate, and constant. The men who harvested ice didn't just battle the cold, they battled the ice itself. And every block they cut, every step they took, was a testament to their courage, their skill, and their willingness to face the frozen unknown. The cold could kill you slowly. It wasn't always dramatic. No sudden plunge into icy water or catastrophic collapse of a frozen lake. Sometimes it crept in quietly, inching through layers of wool and leather, numbing fingers, stiffening joints, and burning lungs with every breath. For the ice workers of the 1800s, the cold was a constant companion, a silent predator that wore down the body day after day, hour after hour. Wrapped in layers, they still couldn't escape its grip. Frostbite was one of the most feared afflictions. It began with a tingling sensation, a warning that blood flow was slowing. Then came the numbness, the loss of feeling, the pale skin that turned waxy and hard. If untreated, the flesh blackened, dying from the inside out. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were especially vulnerable. Workers learned to recognize the signs, the stiffness, the discoloration, and they tried to warm affected areas with breath, friction, or fire. But once frostbite set in deeply, there was little to be done. Amputation was common. Some men lost digits, others entire limbs. The cold didn't discriminate. It took what it wanted. Breathing in frigid air was another torment. The lungs burned, the throat tightened, and coughing fits became routine. The cold air was dry and sharp, irritating the respiratory system and making every breath a struggle. Workers often wrapped scarves around their faces, trying to filter the air and trap some warmth. But after hours on the ice, the scarves froze, stiffening like boards. Ice crystals formed on eyelashes and beards. Talking became painful. Silence settled in, broken only by the sound of saws and sleds. Layering was essential, but never enough. Wool coats, flannel shirts, thick trousers, and felt-lined boots all helped, but none could fully block the cold. The chill seeped through seams, crept down collars, and settled into bones. Movement helped. Workers stayed active, constantly lifting, cutting, dragging. But even then, the cold found its way in. Standing still for even a few minutes could be dangerous. Fires were built on shore, and men rotated through, warming hands and faces before returning to the ice. The heat was fleeting. The cold always returned. Sleep offered little relief. In bunkhouses near the lakes, workers huddled under blankets, their breath fogging the air. The buildings were drafty, the stoves barely sufficient. Some men slept in their work clothes, too cold to undress. Frost formed on windows and walls. In the morning, boots were stiff, gloves frozen, and the cycle began again. The cold didn't rest, and neither did the men. The psychological toll was immense. Constant exposure to freezing temperatures wore down morale. Tempers flared. Jokes turned bitter. The isolation of the ice harvest, the long hours, the remote locations, added to the strain. Some men broke down. Others became numb, emotionally as well as physically. The cold didn't just attack the body. It invaded the mind. And yet, the work continued. The ice had to be harvested. The trade depended on it. Families relied on the income. Communities thrived on the industry. The men who endured the cold did so with a mix of pride, desperation, and sheer willpower. They developed rituals, warming hands over lanterns, stuffing newspapers into boots, drinking hot coffee laced with whiskey. These small comforts helped, but they were no match for the deep freeze. Injuries from the cold were common. Frostbite, hypothermia, chilblains, all left lasting scars. Some men never fully recovered. Their fingers remained stiff, their skin mottled. Others developed chronic respiratory issues from breathing the icy air. The cold left its mark, visible and invisible. Despite the suffering, there was a strange camaraderie among ice workers. They shared the burden, looked out for each other, and celebrated small victories. A warm fire, a good meal, a day without injury. They joked about the cold, mocked its persistence, and told stories of the worst winters. These stories became legend, passed down through generations, shaping the identity of the trade. Today, the cold is tamed by technology. Heated clothing, insulated gear, and climate-controlled environments have replaced the brutal conditions of the past. But in the 1800s, ice workers faced the elements with little more than grit and wool. The cold could kill you slowly, and they knew it. Yet they stepped onto the ice each day, defying nature, harvesting winter, and enduring the chill that never truly left. Teamwork wasn't optional. It was survival. On the frozen lakes of 19th century New England, where ice harvesting was both an economic necessity and a daily gamble with death, no man could afford to work alone. The blocks of ice were massive, the tools unwieldy, and the environment unforgiving. Every movement had to be coordinated, every decision shared. A single misstep could mean injury, catastrophe, or even death. In this world, camaraderie wasn't just a comfort, it was a lifeline. From the moment the crews stepped onto the ice before dawn, they operated as a unit. The process of harvesting ice was a complex choreography requiring strength, timing, and trust. First came the scoring. Horse-drawn plows etched grids into the frozen surface, guided by men who walked alongside, steering and adjusting. Then came the cutting. Workers wielded long iron saws, often in pairs, slicing through the ice with synchronized strokes. The rhythm was crucial. If one man pulled too hard or too fast, the saw could bind or veer off course. Precision mattered. So did patience. Once the blocks were freed, the real test of teamwork began. Each block weighed hundreds of pounds and had to be maneuvered across the slick surface without cracking or slipping. Men used iron tongs, ropes, and poles to drag the ice toward shore or onto sleds. This required coordination. One man guiding, another pulling, others stabilizing. Communication was constant, often shouted over the wind or signaled with gestures. Everyone had to know their role. Everyone had to anticipate the next move. The danger was ever present. A block could shift unexpectedly, crushing a foot or pinning a leg. A sled could tip, sending ice skidding across the lake. The surface itself was treacherous, slick, uneven, and prone to cracking. If one man lost his footing, he could take others down with him. If a block fell into a channel, someone had to retrieve it, often by leaning dangerously close to the edge or using poles to fish it out. The risk of falling through was real, and the cold water below was merciless. That's why trust was everything. Ice crews were often made up of men who had worked together for years. They knew each other's strengths, weaknesses, and habits. They developed unspoken signals, shared jokes, and relied on instinct. A glance could mean pull harder. A grunt could mean watch your footing. These bonds were forged in frost and sweat, tested daily by the demands of the harvest. Newcomers had to earn their place. They started with lighter tasks, stacking sawdust, guiding sleds, watching and learning. Veterans taught them the rhythms, corrected their mistakes, and kept them safe. But mistakes had consequences. A misjudged lift could injure a teammate. A moment of distraction could lead to disaster. The ice was unforgiving, and so were the crews. Respect was earned through effort, reliability, and the willingness to put the team first. Even off the ice, the sense of unity persisted. In bunkhouses and taverns, workers shared meals, stories, and laughter. They celebrated successful harvests, mourned lost comrades, and supported each other through injuries and hardships. The bonds extended beyond the lake, into families, neighborhoods, and generations. Sons followed fathers into the trade. Brothers worked side by side. The ice harvest was more than a job. It was a shared identity. The logistics of moving ice also demanded teamwork. In the ice houses, blocks had to be stacked with precision, layered with sawdust, and positioned for easy access. This required coordination between harvest crews, transport teams, and storage workers. Everyone had to be in sync. A poorly stacked block could collapse. A misaligned row could waste space or damage the ice. The work was physical, but also strategic, and it was always collaborative. During shipment, the teamwork extended even further. Ice was loaded onto trains and ships, packed tightly to minimize melting. Crews worked in shifts, passing blocks hand to hand, guiding them into place. Timing was crucial. Delays could mean spoilage. Miscommunication could ruin a load. The success of the entire operation depended on the seamless cooperation of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals. In moments of crisis, teamwork became even more vital. If someone fell through the ice, the crew responded instantly. Ropes were thrown, poles extended, fires lit. Men risked their own safety to save a teammate. These rescues were dangerous and didn't always succeed, but they were instinctive. No one was left behind. The bond between workers was stronger than fear. Today, the legacy of that teamwork lives on in stories, photographs, and rusted tools. The ice trade may have vanished, replaced by machines and refrigeration. But the spirit of those crews, their unity, their resilience, their shared purpose remains a powerful testament to human collaboration under extreme conditions. On the ice, survival wasn't about individual strength. It was about trust, timing, and the unbreakable bond between men who knew that their lives depended on each other. Once cut, ice didn't just sit idle on the shore. It began a journey, one that could span hundreds or even thousands of miles, crossing frozen fields, winding rivers, and steel rails. Hauling ice was a monumental task, requiring strength, coordination, and an intricate network of transportation. In the 1800s, before refrigeration and modern logistics, moving ice was a feat of ingenuity and endurance. It started with horse-drawn sleds and ended in distant cities, tropical ports, and colonial outposts where winter never came. The first leg of the journey was often the most grueling. After workers carved massive blocks from frozen lakes, they used iron tongs and poles to drag them across the slick surface to shore. There, horse-drawn sleds waited, sturdy wooden platforms mounted on runners, designed to glide over snow and ice. Horses, wrapped in blankets and fitted with studded shoes for traction, pulled these sleds through biting winds and deep drifts. The blocks were stacked carefully, balanced to avoid tipping, and lashed down with ropes. Drivers guided the teams along narrow paths, navigating around trees, rocks, and other hazards. The sleds carried the ice to nearby ice houses, towering structures built to store the harvest until it could be shipped. These buildings were marvels of design, with thick wooden walls, sawdust insulation, and ventilation systems to keep the interior cold. Workers unloaded the sleds, stacking the blocks in neat rows, layering them with sawdust to prevent melting and sticking. The ice houses became temporary vaults, holding the season's bounty until demand called it forth. From the ice houses, the ice moved again, this time by rail or river. Railroads played a crucial role in the expansion of the ice trade. Special boxcars were outfitted with insulation, allowing ice to travel long distances without melting. These cars were loaded with precision, the blocks packed tightly to minimize air pockets. Trains carried ice to cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, where it was distributed to homes, businesses, and hospitals. The rail lines connected rural harvesting sites with urban markets, turning frozen ponds into engines of commerce. Rivers and canals offered another route. Barges, flat-bottomed and spacious, were ideal for hauling ice. Workers loaded them by hand, using ramps and pulleys to guide the blocks aboard. The barges floated down waterways, like the Kennebec River in Maine, heading toward coastal ports where ships waited. These vessels, often retrofitted for ice transport, carried the cargo across oceans to the Caribbean, South America, India, and beyond. The journey was long and perilous. Ice melted, storms struck. Delays could ruin entire shipments. But when successful, the rewards were immense. The logistics of hauling ice were staggering. Every step required coordination, from the timing of the harvest to the loading of trains and ships. Schedules had to align. Weather had to cooperate. Workers had to move quickly and efficiently. A single bottleneck could disrupt the entire chain. And yet, year after year, the system worked. Ice harvested in January could arrive in Havana by March, in Calcutta by May. It was a triumph of planning, labor, and sheer determination. The journey of ice was also a journey of transformation. Along the way, it passed through towns, cities, and cultures. It was touched by countless hands, cutters, haulers, loaders, sailors, merchants. Each played a role in delivering winter to places where it never existed. In tropical cities, the arrival of ice was an event. Crowds gathered. Newspapers reported. Hotels advertised chilled drinks. Hospitals prepared treatments. Ice was more than a commodity. It was a marvel. But the journey wasn't without cost. Horses labored in brutal conditions. Workers suffered injuries. Ice melted, wasted by heat, or mishandling. The trade consumed vast resources: wood for sleds and ice houses, coal for trains, manpower for every link in the chain. It was a massive undertaking, driven by demand and sustained by grit. The ice house was a chilling fortress, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. These massive, sawdust-insulated buildings loomed over the landscape like silent sentinels of winter, built to preserve the harvest long after the lakes had thawed. Cold, dark, and eerie, they were essential to the ice trade, yet they carried an aura of danger and mystery. Inside, the air was thick with frost and silence. A single misstep could mean injury, entrapment, or even death. Constructed with thick timber walls and packed with insulation, usually sawdust from nearby mills, ice houses were designed to hold thousands of tons of ice. Their architecture was simple but effective. Tall, windowless structures with steep roofs to shed snow and rain, and layered interiors that kept the temperature low even in summer. The sawdust acted as a thermal barrier, filling gaps between blocks and lining the walls to prevent heat from seeping in. It was cheap, abundant, and surprisingly efficient. Entering an ice house was like stepping into another world. The temperature dropped instantly, and the light vanished. Most ice houses had no windows, and the only illumination came from lanterns carried by workers. The walls absorbed sound, creating a muffled, almost claustrophobic environment. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of wood, mold, and cold. Ice blocks towered in neat stacks, separated by layers of sawdust, forming corridors and chambers that stretched into the shadows. Navigating these spaces required caution and experience. The floors were slippery, often coated in a thin layer of frost or wet sawdust. The stacks could shift unexpectedly, and a poorly placed step might trigger a collapse. Workers moved slowly, using poles and hooks to guide blocks into place. They wore thick gloves and boots, but the cold penetrated everything. Breathing was difficult. Talking was rare. The ice house demanded silence and focus. Accidents were common. A block could fall from a stack, crushing a foot or pinning a leg. A worker could slip and hit his head, or become trapped between shifting rows. In some cases, men were buried in sawdust or lost in the maze-like interior. Rescue was difficult. The darkness, the cold, and the sheer weight of the ice made every emergency a race against time. Fires were kept burning outside, ready to warm injured workers. But inside, there was no warmth, only the relentless chill. Despite the danger, ice houses were marvels of engineering. They allowed ice harvested in winter to be stored and sold throughout the year. Merchants could plan shipments months in advance. Cities could rely on a steady supply. Hospitals, restaurants, and households had access to ice, even in the heat of summer. The ice house was the backbone of the trade, turning a seasonal product into a year-round commodity. Building and maintaining these structures was a community effort. Local carpenters, laborers, and millers contributed materials and expertise. The sawdust came from nearby lumber operations, often delivered by the cartload. Repairs were constant. Roofs leaked, walls warped, and insulation settled. Workers patched holes, reinforced beams, and monitored temperatures. The ice house was a living system, demanding care and vigilance. Some towns had multiple ice houses, each serving different clients or regions. The largest could store tens of thousands of tons, with complex layouts and loading docks for trains and barges. These facilities operated like warehouses, with inventory systems, schedules, and crews dedicated to maintenance and distribution. The ice was tracked, rotated, and shipped with precision. A successful ice house was a source of pride, a symbol of prosperity and progress. But for the workers inside, the ice house remained a place of hardship. The conditions were harsh, the risks real, and the rewards modest. They labored in silence, stacking blocks, shoveling sawdust, and navigating the cold. Their efforts kept the trade alive, ensured the survival of communities, and delivered winter to the world. Yet their names were rarely recorded, their stories seldom told. Today, most ice houses are gone. Some collapsed from neglect. Others were dismantled, their wood repurposed, their sawdust scattered. A few remain as museums or historical sites, reminders of a time when ice was harvested, stored, and shipped by hand. But in the 1800s, the ice house was more than a building. It was a fortress, chilling, dangerous, and vital. It held the season in its walls, preserved the labor of thousands, and stood as a testament to human ingenuity in the face of nature's harshest element.
Fires were rare, but deadly in the world of 19th century. Ice harvesting, where the cold was constant and the work revolved around preserving frozen water. Fire might seem like an unlikely threat, yet it was one of the most feared disasters in the industry. When an ice house caught fire, the consequences were swift and catastrophic. The heat didn't just destroy the structure, it melted tons of stored product, erased months of labor, and crippled entire communities overnight. Ice houses were built to keep cold in and heat out. Their thick wooden walls, packed with sawdust insulation, were designed to maintain low temperatures, even in the heat of summer. But that very design made them vulnerable. Sawdust, while excellent for insulation, was also highly flammable. Dry, loose, and abundant, it could ignite with a single spark. And once it did, the fire spread fast, feeding on the wood, the dust, and the oxygen trapped inside. The irony was brutal. These buildings were fortresses of frost, yet they burned like tin. Workers feared fire more than almost anything. A blaze could start from a lantern knocked over, a stove left unattended, or even spontaneous combustion in piles of sawdust. Once flames took hold, there was little hope of containment. The heat warped beams, collapsed walls, and turned ice into water in hours. Entire harvests, thousands of tons of ice, could vanish in a single night. The aftermath was devastating. Melted ice flooded the surrounding area, soaking fields, roads, and homes. The ground turned to slush, and the air filled with steam and smoke. The loss of product meant financial ruin for merchants. unemployment for workers, and disruption for cities that depended on ice shipments. Insurance was rare, and rebuilding was slow. Some towns never recovered. Others rebuilt only to face the same threat again. Firefighting in these conditions was nearly impossible. Water was frozen. Equipment was rudimentary. Crews used shovels, buckets, and desperation. They tried to smother flames with snow, dig fire breaks in the sawdust, and pull down burning walls to stop the spread. But the cold worked against them. Hoses froze. Pumps failed. And the fire raged on. The contrast was surreal. Flames roaring through a building designed to hold ice. Steam rising into the winter sky. Men battling heat in a world of frost. Some ice houses implemented safety measures. Lanterns were banned inside. Stoves were kept outside or in separate buildings. Sawdust was compacted to reduce air pockets. Fire breaks were built into the design. Empty corridors meant to slow the spread. But these precautions weren't always enough. Accidents happened. Sparks flew. And when they did, the results were catastrophic. The psychological toll was immense. Workers would spend weeks harvesting, hauling, and stacking ice watched their efforts vanish in smoke. Their sense of helplessness was overwhelming. There was no way to fight the fire effectively. No way to salvage the product. The only option was to flee, to mourn, and to start again. Communities rallied, but the scars remained. Despite the danger, ice houses continued to be built because they were essential. The trade depended on them. Cities needed ice. Merchants needed storage. And so the risk was accepted, managed, and endured. Fires were rare, but they were part of the reality. A constant threat, lurking in the background, waiting for a spark. Today, the idea of an ice house burning seems paradoxical. But in the 1800s, it was a nightmare that haunted the industry. These chilling fortresses, built to preserve winter, could be undone by a flicker of phlegm. And when they burned, they took more than ice. They took livelihoods, hope, and the fragile balance between nature and human ambition.
Children joined the harvest too. In the frozen world of 19th century icework, where survival often depended on every able body contributing, even the youngest were called to the lake. In poorer families, boys as young as 8 or 9 were sent onto the ice, not for adventure or play, but to work. They slipped, shivered, and sometimes vanished beneath the surface. The ice trade didn't discriminate by age. If you could lift, drag, or stack, you were part of the crew. For many families, winter was a time of scarcity. Farms lay dormant, and other trades slowed. The ice harvest offered a rare opportunity for income, and every hand counted. Fathers brought sons, older brothers watched over younger ones, and boys learned quickly that the frozen lake was no place for hesitation. They were given smaller tasks at first, sweeping sawdust, guiding sleds, fetching tools. But soon, they were cutting, hauling, and stacking alongside grown men. The conditions were brutal. The cold didn't spare children. Their fingers turned numb, their cheeks burned red, and their boots soaked through with icy water. Clothing was often hand-me-down and inadequate. Thin coats, patched gloves, and worn-out shoes. They wrapped scarves around their faces, but the wind found its way in. Frostbite was common. So was exhaustion. Yet they kept working, driven by duty, fear, and the hope of earning a few coins to bring home. The danger was constant. Ice was unpredictable, and children lacked the weight and experience to navigate it safely. They slipped more often, misjudged distances, and struggled with heavy tools. Some fell through cracks. Others were struck by falling blocks or caught between sleds. Rescue was difficult. The cold water shocked their small bodies instantly, and even if pulled out quickly, the damage could be permanent. Some never came back up. Their names were whispered in sorrow, their stories etched into local memory. Despite the risks, there was pride in joining the harvest. Boys saw it as a rite of passage, a step toward manhood, a way to prove themselves. They mimicked the older workers, learned the rhythms of the saw, and competed to carry the heaviest blocks. The camaraderie was strong. Older men looked out for the younger ones, taught them tricks, and shared food around fires. There was laughter, too, moments of joy amid the hardship. Snowball fights during breaks, stories told in bunkhouses, songs sung to keep spirits high. But the reality was harsh. Education was often sacrificed. School took a back seat to survival. Some boys missed entire winters of classes, returning in spring with calloused hands and tired eyes. Others never went back at all. The ice trade shaped their futures, physically, mentally, and economically. It taught resilience, but also exposed them to trauma and loss. Communities accepted child labor as a necessity. There were few regulations and little oversight. The ice harvest was seasonal, rural, and largely invisible to reformers. Parents made hard choices: send a child to work or risk hunger. The decision was painful, but often unavoidable. And so the lakes filled with small figures, bundled in layers, dragging blocks and wielding tools far too large for their hands. Some towns tried to protect their children. They assigned lighter duties, kept them near shore, and enforced curfews. But accidents still happened. The ice didn't care about age. It cracked, shifted, and swallowed without mercy. And when tragedy struck, the community mourned, briefly, quietly, and then returned to work. The harvest couldn't wait. Ice went global, and so did the danger. In the 19th century, blocks of frozen water carved from lakes in New England didn't just chill drinks in Boston or preserve meat in New York. They traveled thousands of miles, crossing oceans to reach the sweltering ports of the Caribbean, the colonial cities of India, and the tropical outposts of Southeast Asia. It was a logistical marvel, a triumph of human ingenuity. But with that expansion came new risks, ones that were just as deadly as the freezing conditions of the harvest. Shipping ice to tropical climates was a bold endeavor. The blocks were packed tightly in sawdust, loaded into insulated holds of specially outfitted ships, and sent on long voyages through unpredictable seas. The goal was simple: deliver winter to places that had never known it. And when it worked, it was transformative. Ice allowed for cold drinks, preserved food, and medical treatments. It became a symbol of luxury, modernity, and colonial power. But the journey was fraught with peril. Loading and unloading ice was dangerous, even in cold climates. The blocks were massive, often weighing hundreds of pounds, and slippery. Workers used iron thongs, hooks, and brute strength to maneuver them. In tropical ports, the challenge intensified. The heat caused the ice to sweat, making it even harder to grip. The sawdust insulation clung to skin and clothes, creating a choking dust in the humid air. The blocks had to be moved quickly to prevent melting, but haste increased the risk of accidents. Collapse was a constant threat. Stacks of ice, if not balanced perfectly, could shift and fall. A single block could crush a foot, break a leg, or kill a man outright. In the confined spaces of ship holds and warehouses, there was little room to escape. Workers labored in teams, shouting warnings, coordinating lifts, and praying the stacks would hold. Injuries were common. Fatalities were not unheard of. Heat stroke was another killer. Men accustomed to cold climates found themselves unloading ice in temperatures that soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. The contrast was brutal. The body struggled to adapt. Sweat poured, vision blurred, and muscles weakened. Some collapsed on the spot. Others pushed through, only to suffer later. There was little medical support and even less understanding of the dangers. The irony was cruel, surrounded by ice, yet dying of heat. Local laborers often bore the brunt of the risk. In places like Calcutta, Havana, and Singapore, colonial authorities hired native workers to unload and distribute the ice. These men had no experience with the product, no protective gear, and no training. They worked barefoot, shirtless, and desperate for wages. The blocks burned their skin, crushed their limbs, and exposed them to unfamiliar hazards. Their deaths were rarely recorded. Their stories mostly lost. Despite the danger, the trade flourished. Ice became essential in tropical cities. Hospitals used it to treat fevers and preserve medicine. Hotels served chilled drinks to wealthy guests. Fishmongers and butchers extended the shelf life of their goods. The presence of ice elevated a city's status, signaling its connection to global commerce and technological progress. But behind the glamour was a trail of suffering, from the frozen lakes of New England to the sun-baked docks of Bombay. The logistics of global ice shipping were staggering. Timing was everything. Ships had to depart immediately after harvest, sail quickly, and arrive before the ice melted. Delays meant disaster. Storms, mechanical failures, and political unrest could ruin entire shipments. Merchants tracked weather patterns, negotiated port access, and built insulated warehouses in foreign cities. The infrastructure grew, but so did the risks. Even unloading the ice into storage was perilous. The buildings were often poorly ventilated, dark, and slippery. Workers moved quickly, stacking blocks and sawdust, trying to preserve as much as possible. The heat made the air thick, the sawdust clung to sweat, and the ice hissed as it melted. Fires were a threat, as were cave-ins and suffocation. The job was relentless, and the danger omnipresent. Yet the trade continued. The profits were too great, the demand too high. Ice became a global commodity, harvested in winter and consumed in summer, born in frost and delivered to fire. It connected continents, shaped economies, and changed lives. But it also claimed lives, quietly, brutally, and often invisibly. Today, the global ice trade is a forgotten chapter in history. Refrigeration has replaced the ships, the sawdust, and the sweat. But in the 1800s, ice went global, and so did the danger. From the frozen lakes to the tropical docks, it was a story of ambition, ingenuity, and sacrifice. A story carved in ice and paid for in blood. Freak accidents and frozen corpses were grim realities in the world of 19th century ice harvesting. The work was brutal, the environment unforgiving, and the margin for error razor thin. Eyewitness accounts from the time speak of men crushed between blocks, trapped beneath falling slabs, or swallowed whole by the icy depths. Their bodies only recovered come spring, when the thaw revealed what winter had hidden. These were not rare occurrences. They were part of the rhythm of the trade, whispered in bunkhouses, etched into local memory, and buried beneath layers of silence and snow. The ice harvest was a dangerous ballet. Men moved in tight formations across frozen lakes, wielding heavy tools and guiding massive blocks with iron tongs and ropes. The ice beneath them groaned and shifted, a living surface that could betray them at any moment. A single misstep, a moment of distraction, or a crack in the wrong place could trigger disaster. Blocks weighing hundreds of pounds could tip, slide, or fall with crushing force. The sound of ice collapsing was sudden and final, A thunderous crack, a splash, and then silence. Some accidents were swift and merciless. A man guiding a block into an ice house might lose his footing, fall backward, and be pinned between slabs. Others were slower, more horrifying. Workers trapped beneath shifting stacks of ice could scream for help, their voices muffled by sawdust and timber. Rescue was difficult. The blocks were too heavy, the space too tight, the cold too intense. In some cases, crews had no choice but to wait, to dig slowly, methodically, hoping the man was still alive. Often he wasn't. The most chilling stories came from those who fell through the ice. The surface could crack without warning, especially near currents, thin spots, or areas weakened by overuse. One moment a man was walking, the next he was gone, plunged into freezing water, his breath stolen, his limbs paralyzed. The shock was immediate. Heavy clothing dragged him down. The ice closed above him, and unless someone was close with a rope or pole, there was no escape. In many cases, the body wasn't recovered until spring, when the ice melted and the lake gave up its dead. These tragedies left deep scars on the communities that depended on the ice trade. Families mourned quietly. Funerals were held in frozen churches. Names were carved into simple headstones. But the work continued. The harvest couldn't stop. The ice had to be cut, hauled, and shipped. And so the danger became part of the culture, accepted, endured, and rarely spoken of aloud. Eyewitness accounts from the time are haunting. One man described watching a coworker crushed by a falling slab, his body pinned and broken before anyone could react. Another recalled the eerie silence after a man fell through the ice, the crew standing still, listening for a splash, a cry, anything. There was nothing. Just the wind, the cold, and the knowledge that someone had vanished. Some workers carried talismans, lucky coins, religious medals, scraps of cloth from loved ones. Superstition mingled with survival. They believed in omens, in signs from the ice, in the whispers of those who had died before. The lakes were sacred and feared. They gave life, and they took it. Despite the danger, men kept coming. The pay was better than many winter jobs. The camaraderie was strong, and the pride of working the ice was real. But every crew had stories. Every town had names. And every harvest carried the weight of those who had been lost. Today, the frozen corpses of the ice trade are long gone, buried in cemeteries or forgotten in unmarked graves. But their legacy remains in the rusted tools, the faded photographs, and the stories passed down through generations. The ice harvest was a triumph of human endurance, but it came at a terrible cost. Freak accidents weren't freakish at all. They were inevitable, and the frozen bodies beneath the surface were reminders of the price paid to carve winter from the earth. The rise of refrigeration killed the industry. Slowly, quietly, and inevitably, the hum of artificial cooling replaced the crack of iron saws on frozen lakes. The ice trade, once a global enterprise powered by muscle, horses, and winter itself, began to fade. But not before thousands of men risked, and sometimes lost, their lives carving blocks of frozen water from the earth and sending them across oceans. It was a death not of drama, but of progress, and it changed everything. For decades, natural ice was indispensable. It preserved food, cooled drinks, and enabled medical treatments. It was harvested in winter, stored in sawdust-insulated ice houses, and shipped by rail and sea to cities near and far. The trade employed thousands, shaped economies, and connected continents. But it was also fragile, dependent on weather, labor, and logistics. A warm winter could ruin a harvest. A fire could destroy an ice house. A delay could melt a shipment. The system worked, but it was always on edge. Then came refrigeration. The earliest experiments in artificial cooling began in the mid-19th century. Inventors like John Gorey and Carl von Lind explored ways to mechanically produce ice and lower temperatures using compressed gases and chemical reactions. Their machines were crude, expensive, and limited in scope, but they hinted at a future where cold could be manufactured, not harvested. A future where winter could be summoned with the flip of a switch. At first, the ice trade dismissed these machines. They were unreliable, costly, and unfamiliar. Natural ice was abundant, trusted, and entrenched. But technology doesn't wait. As refrigeration improved, its advantages became clear. It didn't depend on seasons. It didn't require armies of laborers. It could be installed in homes, businesses, and ships. It was clean, efficient, and scalable. By the late 1800s, artificial ice plants began to appear in cities. They produced ice year-round, using ammonia-based systems and steam power. Restaurants, hospitals, and food distributors embraced the new technology. Railroads installed refrigerated cars. Ships added cooling systems. The demand for natural ice began to decline. For the men who worked the lakes, the change was devastating. Towns built around the ice harvest saw their economies collapse. Ice houses were abandoned. Tools rusted. Families moved away. The pride of the trade, the skill, the endurance, the camaraderie, was replaced by machines. And while refrigeration brought comfort and convenience, it also erased a way of life. Some tried to adapt. Ice companies invested in artificial plants. Workers sought jobs in other industries. But the transition was uneven. Many were left behind. The knowledge of reading ice, guiding horses, and stacking blocks became obsolete. The stories of frozen mornings, freak accidents, and heroic rescues faded into memory. Yet the legacy of the ice trade endures. It laid the foundation for modern refrigeration. It taught the world the value of cold, and it revealed the lengths to which people would go to preserve, protect, and provide. The men who risked their lives on frozen lakes didn't just harvest ice. They built an industry, a culture, and a global network that changed the way humans lived. Today, we open refrigerators without thinking. We sip iced drinks in tropical heat. We store food for weeks. But behind every cube of ice is a history carved in frost and paid for in blood. The rise of refrigeration killed the industry, but not the memory. And in that memory, the ice still glistens. They harvested winter so others could taste summer. That was the cruel irony at the heart of the 19th century ice trade. While wealthy families sipped chilled wine in drawing rooms, and colonial officials in tropical outposts preserved meat and medicine with imported ice, the men who made it all possible labored in silence, frostbitten and forgotten. They carved blocks of frozen water from the earth, hauled them across snow-covered fields, stacked them in dark ice houses, and watched them vanish into ships bound for warmer worlds. And yet, they rarely, if ever, enjoyed the luxury they created. The ice workers lived in cold. They woke before dawn, trudged through snow, and spent their days on frozen lakes. Their breath hung in the air, their fingers stiffened, and their boots soaked through with icy slush. They swung iron saws, guided horse-drawn sleds, and stacked blocks that weighed more than they did. The cold was constant, not a refreshing chill, but a biting, numbing force that seeped into their bones. They didn't drink iced lemonade or store fresh meat. They ate salted pork, drank lukewarm coffee, and warmed themselves by fires built from scrap wood. Their labor was invisible to the people who benefited from it. In Havana, Calcutta, and New Orleans, ice was a marvel, a symbol of progress, wealth, and modernity. It cooled drinks, preserved delicacies, and elevated social status. But few paused to consider where it came from, or who had risked their lives to deliver it. The workers were nameless, faceless, and distant. Their stories didn't appear in newspapers. Their injuries were recorded. Their deaths were mourned quietly, if at all. Even in their own towns, Ice workers were often overlooked. The harvest was seasonal, the pay modest, and the recognition minimal. They were seen as laborers, not craftsmen, despite the skill, strength, and coordination required to do the job. They developed techniques for reading ice, guiding blocks, and surviving the cold. They trained newcomers, rescued teammates, and endured conditions that would break most men. Yet their names rarely appeared in company records. Their contributions were buried beneath layers of sawdust and silence. The contrast was stark. In tropical cities, ice was celebrated. It was served in crystal glasses, stored in ornate chests, and used to treat the sick. It was a luxury, a comfort, a miracle. But for the men who harvested it, it was a burden. They didn't taste the summer they enabled. They didn't feel the relief of a cool breeze or the pleasure of a chilled dessert. They felt the sting of frostbite, the ache of exhaustion, and the weight of blocks that never stopped coming. Some workers dreamed of escaping the cold, of moving south, of finding work in warmer climates. But most stayed. The ice trade was all they knew. It was a source of pride, despite the pain. They took satisfaction in their skill, in the camaraderie of the crew, in the knowledge that they were part of something bigger. They didn't seek luxury. They sought survival, and they found it in the rhythm of the saw, the warmth of the fire, and the shared struggle of the harvest. Their legacy is quiet but enduring. The ice they harvested changed the world. It enabled refrigeration, transformed food storage, and reshaped global trade. It brought comfort to millions. And it did so on the backs of men whose names we've mostly forgotten. But they mattered. They were the foundation of the industry, the muscle behind the miracle, the winter behind the summer. Today, when we drop ice cubes into a drink or open a freezer full of food, we rarely think of the men who once carved blocks from frozen lakes and shipped them across oceans. But we should, because they harvested winter so others could taste summer. And in doing so, they gave us more than cold. They gave us comfort, connection, and a glimpse of what human endurance can achieve. The story of 19th century ice workers is one of grit, danger, and sacrifice. These men carved winter from frozen lakes, risking frostbite, drowning, and crushing injuries, all so others could enjoy the luxury of chilled drinks and preserved food. They labored in silence, often forgotten by history, while their product traveled the globe, transforming life in places that had never known cold. From the eerie depths of ice houses to the blistering heat of tropical docks, their legacy is etched in every cube of ice we take for granted today. If this journey through the frozen past moved you, taught you something new, or simply made you appreciate the comfort of modern refrigeration, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten industries, untold stories, and the people who shaped our world in ways we rarely notice. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. Thanks for watching, and next time you reach for ice, remember the men who harvested winter so the world could taste summer.